Hello everyone, this is Mai Burke here, and I'm going to give a short presentation about enhancing students' feedback literacy through a peer review activity. The infamous feedback. Some of you may even have had negative experiences around feedback, thinking, oh, it's quite effortful, it's time consuming, and a lot of work can go into it when students mightn't even access the feedback, let alone use it. We know that feedback can have a positive impact on a student's development, but only if the learner gains from the feedback that they receive. It is really important to remember that both teacher and the student have responsibility when it comes to feedback. It's very much double-sided, a two-way street. But once the teacher gives the feedback, it is up to the student whether or not they want to access it or act upon it. That said, we have to consider that there are several different reasons that students may not implement the feedback that they're given. A common factor is that often feedback can come at the end of the semester, after their final deadlines, after all of their assessments have been submitted. So they actually can't implement the feedback that they've been given for that assessment because it's over. It also may be because they just don't understand the language that's used in the feedback, that maybe it's not detailed enough. For example, a statement that just says needs improvement but doesn't give an example onto how this work could be improved. And a simple reason might be as well, the students just don't know how to access it. This is where student motivation plays a key part. They have to have the desire to improve and take ownership over the assessment. You may have even heard phrases like, well, I don't know where to find the feedback, or things like, I don't know what this feedback means, or even, I don't know how to use the feedback that I was given. This means that these students are not feedback literate. They don't have an understanding of feedback. Feedback literacy and its development is really important so that students understand where they can access their feedback, understand the feedback that's given to them, and the language used. But also this aids them in feeling confident when using what they've learned from their given feedback in their future work. And hopefully, in turn, this will encourage their self-regulation skills, their academic writing skills, and benefit the overall assessment process. Using activities like peer review are a great way to develop students' feedback literacy, as it makes feedback part of the module and part of the assessment from the very beginning of the semester. If students have a better understanding of feedback and have access to it throughout the semester, there's less pressure on the lecturer or the teacher at the end of the semester, that final grading time. Not only this, but it gets students thinking about their assessment and not leaving it until the very last minute. Oftentimes you'd even find that students will try their best, they'll aim to have some sort of a draft piece done if they feel they'll get feedback on it and they could benefit from this feedback, that is before the final submission of their assessment. Peer review offers an opportunity to become fully feedback literate, as students must both give and receive feedback. Not only then are they benefiting from the reviews that their peers are giving their work, but they're looking and thinking critically about what others are writing and what content is there and how things are structured. Is it clear? And the different academic conventions. They develop an understanding of different assessment criteria, and they're also exposed to different approaches and perspectives to their own. In peer review, it's not about clapping another student on the back and saying it's great. They're very much encouraged to examine in detail the piece of draft writing they're given and critique it against the requirements. A constructive critique. I'd like to take you through a peer review activity that I facilitated with one of my first year groups of students. So think now, first years would be very inexperienced. They wouldn't have a deep understanding of feedback or much confidence in using feedback that they were given. I think it's important too to note that a peer review activity does have to be planned because there is some preparation involved. So we spent some time exploring the assessment rubric, explaining the language that was used in it, what each criteria meant, and what would be expected of the students in their assessment. I then provided a number of guiding questions based on the grading rubric that the students would have to answer when reviewing their peers' drafts. These questions included aspects of structure and clarity, referencing, criticality, relevance to the essay title, and more specific points and questions for the subject matter. With these questions in mind, then, we examined different exemplars that were different strengths and levels of writing, so that the students could see and practice how they would answer these questions in the different scenarios. And the last step in this preparation stage was ensuring that students knew how to access the peer review software, that they would know where they'd be able to see their feedback and where to type it up. And we used PeerMark on Turnitin, as was adequate for our needs. And it just worked simply. The students could submit their drafts, and then once they had submitted their drafts, they were allocated to drafts to review from their peers. So they only had to submit a short draft section of their essay. Moving on to the peer review activity itself then. Students did have a date from the beginning of the module as to when they had to have that short draft submitted. It was beneficial to have a clear timeline for the students from the beginning as to when their drafts were due and their reviews were due and when they would receive their feedback, so they were aware that they could use this feedback in plenty of time before their final submission date. All of these drafts were submitted anonymously, and they were also reviewed anonymously. I think this was crucial, as the students were then confident in submitting their own work, but they also felt then that they could be honest in their reviews, as no one knew who was writing what. After the draft submission date, the students were given 1 week to complete 2 reviews on their peers' work. In this instance, I did allocate module marks to the peer review activity, so the students got marks for submitting their draft assignment and also for the reviews that they conducted. This encouraged students not only to submit their draft for review, but to actually partake in the reviewer role, which is just as, if not more important, than the role of the reviewee. It also meant that all students, took part in the peer review activity. When the deadline for the submission of the reviews passed, I ensured a few things: that students had submitted a draft, that they had reviewed 2 of their peers' drafts, and also that they received 2 reviews each on their draft. I had set a minimum word count for each question review answer to support quality reviews, not yes or no answers. So once I was sure that the students had answered adequately, I released the reviews to the students. They were then able to ask questions during class time about some of the comments on their draft that would further support and improve their work. Consequently, the students were able to use their peer feedback on their final essay submission for this module. I think that there were also transferable skills learned here that they can carry to other modules, as many of the academic writing conventions are similar across the board. After going through this whole process, I decided, in order to measure the students' own understanding of their feedback literacy development, to survey them at the end of the semester. Some of the preliminary findings indicate that students agreed they learned from the whole peer review process and now have a better understanding of feedback and also the grading rubric itself. The majority felt that they learned from assessing others' work and reviewing others' work than the comments received on their own. Fortunately, the students feel more confident in using feedback, asking for feedback, and accessing their feedback in all modules. Most of them also felt that their final submission was better, that it benefited from the peer review activity process. Interestingly, all students that were surveyed agreed that they would take part in a peer review-like activity again. Similarly, they expressed a desire for more support in the area of feedback. This may propose that the students' feedback literacy was indeed enhanced as a result of their engagement in peer review. So what does this mean for practice? Well, I think the crucial thing is incorporating the idea of feed forward. Students having an understanding of the assessment and of the grading rubric and of the feedback process that's in the module from the very beginning of the semester. Making feedback part of the module outline, that it's ingrained, it's there, it's not just an afterthought. It's hoped that an intervention like this would benefit students' literacy development and overall learning, that they'd have an awareness of grading rubrics, that they take them into account across the various modules they'll understand the importance of feedback and the language associated with it. We'd hope that they would begin to develop their critical thinking skills, and it would aid in bridging that gap between what they can do alone and what they can do with support. Facilitating an activity such as this in the middle of the semester may help students to get into that writing frame of mind and encourage them to, start reading around the topic that they've covered in class and ask the necessary questions that they may have. As mentioned already, it's hoped that they would begin to work on their piece of writing then rather than leaving everything until the last minute. Which would just give them the time to develop their arguments, create some drafts, and even just proofread before submission. Receiving feedback after they've submitted their final piece won't be beneficial to them for that specific module. Yes, for future assessments it would be, but not that one at the time. And also, as we said before, they may be exposed to different ideas than they've had themselves. And hopefully all of this in turn would lead to an improved writing performance. Thank you so much for taking the time to access and listen to this short recorded presentation. I hope it was useful. Please see the references used here.